It's July 2nd, 1874. 1,000 soldiers march out of Fort Abraham Lincoln in Dakota Territory. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer rides at the front dressed in buckskin, leading what the U.S. government calls a scientific expedition to explore the Black Hills. But everyone knows what they're really looking for. Riding with those soldiers are 2 civilian miners, several geologists, a photographer, and newspaper reporters. The mission is supposedly to find a site for a military fort and conduct geological surveys. The real mission? Confirm the rumors that had circulated for decades. There was gold in the Black Hills, and if Custer's expedition could prove it, everything would change. Within weeks, they would find what they were looking for. Within a year, thousands of prospectors would flood into territory protected by treaty. Within 2 years, the U.S. government would be at war with the Lakota Sioux, and it would all come down to one simple economic reality. There was gold in the Black Hills. And once Americans knew that, no treaty on earth could keep them out. This is the story of the Black Hills Gold Rush, not the sanitized version where brave prospectors tamed the wilderness, but the real story. A tale of broken promises, deliberate provocation, desperate economics, and a clash between 2 worlds that could only end one way. Between 1876 and the mid-1880s, over 15,000 miners poured into the Black Hills, violating the Treaty of Fort Laramie with every step. They built towns that survive to this day. They extracted millions of dollars in gold, and they triggered a war that would culminate in the most famous defeat in American military history. The treaty was signed on April 29, 1868, and it should have settled everything. The Fort Laramie Treaty established the Great Sioux Reservation, territory spanning present-day South Dakota, west of the Missouri River, including the Black Hills. The treaty was explicit. The Black Hills would be set apart for the absolute and undisturbed use and occupation of the Sioux people. Article 2 stated that no white persons could occupy or pass through the reservation without permission from the Indians. The Black Hills, called Paasapa by the Lakota, were completely off-limits. For the Lakota Sioux, the Black Hills weren't just land. They were the center of the universe, sacred hunting grounds, the place where the spirits dwelled. Generations had come to the Black Hills for vision quests, for spiritual renewal, for connection to everything that made them who they were. But even as the treaty was being signed, rumors circulated, rumors that had persisted since the 1830s, when a few trappers and explorers claimed to have seen gold in the streams of the Black Hills. The U.S. government officially dismissed these rumors. Officially, the Black Hills were geologically unremarkable. Officially, there was no reason to violate the treaty. Unofficially, everyone suspected the truth. By the early 1870s, pressure was building. The Panic of 1873 had devastated the American economy. Banks failed, railroads went bankrupt, unemployment soared. The Northern Pacific Railroad, which had planned to extend through Montana, was in financial collapse. What America needed was an economic stimulus. What politicians and businessmen wanted was confirmation of what the Black Hills contained. In June 1874, the U.S. Army organized what they called a scientific expedition to explore the Black Hills. The stated purpose was to locate a site for a military fort, to survey the region, and to conduct geological studies. The actual purpose was obvious to everyone, especially the Lakota. Custer led approximately 1,000 soldiers, 10 companies of the 7th Cavalry plus 2 companies of infantry, along with 70 Indian scouts. The expedition included 110 wagons, pulled by 6 mule teams, over 1,500 horses and mules, and 300 head of cattle for food. With them rode geologist Newton Winchell, naturalist George Bird Grinnell, photographer William Illingworth, newspaper correspondents, and importantly, 2 civilian miners, Horatio N. Ross and William T. McKay. And in a touch of pure Custer showmanship, a 16-piece military band mounted on white horses. The expedition departed Fort Abraham Lincoln, on July 2, 1874. The band played Gary Owen, Custer's favorite song. They marched southwest, traveling slowly across the prairie, making just 4 to 5 miles some days. Custer was 34 years old, a Civil War hero desperate to rebuild his reputation after several embarrassing scandals. He was charismatic, reckless, and hungry for glory, and he understood that finding gold in the Black Hills would make him famous all over again. The expedition marched directly into the heart of the Black Hills, violating the Treaty of Fort Laramie with every mile. They mapped streams, valleys, and mountains. They hunted elk and deer. They marveled at the towering ponderosa pines in the lush valleys that seemed like paradise compared to the surrounding prairie. On July 22nd, after 20 days and 330 miles, they reached the Black Hills. They set up camp along French Creek. The journey had taken on the air of a picnic. Custer went on hunting expeditions, spent his spare time writing newspaper reports under the pen name Nomad. And then they started looking for gold. The first gold was found on July 27th near what is now Custer, South Dakota. Miner Horatio Ross panned some dirt from French Creek. The pan showed colors, tiny flakes of gold mixed with the sediment, maybe 1.5 to 2 cents worth. It wasn't much, but it was real. 4 days later, on August 1st, the miners made a more significant discovery. Tests indicated that a miner working French Creek could potentially earn up to $150 per day. Whether this was accurate remains disputed. Geologist Newton Winchell later said he doubted the quantity of gold found, noting he hadn't seen it himself. But Custer wasn't interested in doubt. On August 15th, Custer wrote to his superiors, "There is no doubt as to the existence of various metals throughout the hills. Examinations at numerous points confirm and strengthen the fact of the existence of gold in the Black Hills." That phrase, the existence of gold, was all that mattered. Not sacred land, not treaty obligations, not the rights of the Lakota people who had been promised this territory forever. Gold existed in the Black Hills. The news reached the outside world when Scout Charlie Reynolds rode alone through hostile territory to Fort Laramie, covering nearly 100 miles in 4 days. His dispatches were telegraphed east, and newspapers across the country ran headlines. "Gold," proclaimed Dakota Territory's Bismarck Tribune on August 12, 1874. The newspaper predicted the Black Hills would become the El Dorado of America. The reaction was immediate and predictable. By the fall of 1874, small groups of prospectors were already attempting to enter the Black Hills. The U.S. Army, technically bound by the treaty to keep white settlers out, made half-hearted efforts to intercept them. In October 1874, John Gordon, a gambler and opportunist from Iowa, organized what became known as the Gordon Party. 28 men and 1 woman, Annie Talent, all determined to stake claims in the Black Hills. They left Sioux City, Iowa on October 6th, traveling in 6 wagons. To mask their true destination, they painted O'Neill's Colony on 1 wagon, pretending to be settlers heading to Nebraska. They traveled through Norfolk, Nebraska, followed the Niobrara River, crossed into Dakota Territory and the Badlands. They successfully evaded Army patrols. On December 8th, just south of present-day Sturgis, they located Custer's Trail and followed it southwest. On December 23, 1874, they reached French Creek near Custer's old base camp and set up their own camp just to the west. They immediately began constructing a stockade, a fortified log structure they initially called Fort Defiance. Inside the stockade walls, they built 6 cabins, and they started placer mining in the freezing Dakota winter. The work was backbreaking, but they found enough gold to stay motivated. By early 1875, the group was suffering from lack of supplies. Several men, including Gordon, traveled back to Sioux City, Cheyenne, and Chicago, spreading news of their discoveries and recruiting more settlers. In April 1875, the Army finally caught up with the Gordon Party. They escorted them out of the Black Hills under armed guard, covering 421 miles to Fort Laramie. They were told never to return. Most of them were back within months. Gordon and another member tried to return later in 1875, but their wagon train was intercepted and burned by the U.S. Army. It didn't matter. By the summer of 1875, it was clear the situation was unsustainable. Thousands of prospectors were gathering at the edges of the Black Hills, waiting for the right moment to rush in. The Lakota were furious, preparing for war. The Army couldn't patrol hundreds of miles of border. The U.S. government faced a choice: honor the treaty and keep prospectors out by force, or find a way to acquire the Black Hills. They chose the latter. In September 1875, a U.S. commission arrived to negotiate the purchase of the Black Hills. The government offered $6 million for the territory, roughly 10 cents per acre, for land that everyone knew contained millions of dollars in gold. The Lakota refused. Red Cloud, one of the most prominent Lakota leaders, saw through the charade immediately. The commission wasn't negotiating in good faith. They were going through the motions so they could tell Congress they'd tried. The talks collapsed. No sale, no agreement, and the prospectors kept coming. On November 3, 1875, President Ulysses S. Grant convened with his cabinet and made a decision. The Army would do nothing more to stop white settlers from entering the Black Hills. The government had stopped pretending. Then, on December 3rd, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs sent an order to all Lakota bands: report to the reservations by January 31st, 1876, or be considered hostile. This was an impossible demand. The Lakota bands were scattered across a vast territory in the dead of winter. Many never received the message. Those who did couldn't travel in the brutal conditions, and many, led by chiefs like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, simply refused. They weren't the ones violating the treaty. Why should they surrender? When January 31st came and went with most Lakota still on their traditional hunting grounds, the U.S. government declared them hostile. The Army was ordered to bring them in by force. The Great Sioux War had begun, and it started because of gold. The first major wave of prospectors flooded into the Black Hills in the spring of 1876, even as the Army was mobilizing for war against the Lakota. They came from everywhere: miners from California who'd worked the Sierras, prospectors from Montana's gold rush, unemployed workers from eastern cities, farmers fleeing failed homesteads. They came on horseback, in wagons, on foot. They brought shovels, pans, sluice boxes, dreams, and desperation. They established camps that grew into towns almost overnight. Custer City, named for the lieutenant colonel whose expedition had started it all, was founded by prospectors who'd evaded Army patrols. By the spring of 1876, it had hundreds of residents, log cabins, saloons, and a rough main street carved from the forest. Deadwood Gulch was discovered in late 1875 when prospectors found rich gold deposits in Whitewood Creek running through the narrow valley. By mid-1976, Deadwood became the most notorious town in the Black Hills: lawless, violent, and incredibly wealthy. The gold in Deadwood wasn't just traces, it was abundant. Placer mining in the creek beds yielded significant returns. Stories circulated of men finding nuggets worth hundreds of dollars in a single pan. The tales were exaggerated, but not entirely false. Other camps followed: Lead, Rochford, Rapid City, Spearfish. Each started with a few tents and prospectors, then grew as word spread of successful strikes. By late 1876, an estimated 15,000 miners were working in the Black Hills, despite the ongoing war just miles away. The mining techniques were simple at first. Placer mining, the same technique used in California in 1849. Prospectors would dig gravel from stream beds, place it in a pan, add water, and swirl it in a circular motion. The heavy gold would settle to the bottom while the lighter sediment washed away. If the pan showed colors, flakes, or small nuggets of gold, the prospector would stake a claim, usually about 10 feet along the creek bank. Then, he'd build a sluice box, a long wooden trough with ridges called riffles along the bottom. Water would flow through the sluice, carrying gravel and sediment. The gold would catch in the riffles while the waste washed away. It was exhausting work. A miner might process hundreds of pounds of gravel per day, standing in icy water, stooped over for hours, hoping to find enough gold to make it worthwhile. The yields varied wildly. Some men found an ounce of gold per day, worth about $20 in 1876, enough to live comfortably. Others found nothing. Many gave up after weeks of failure and left the Black Hills broke, but enough men struck it rich to keep the rush alive. The stories of success, the prospector who found a 5-ounce nugget, the claim that yielded $20 per pan, spread faster than the stories of failure. By 1877, placer mining was giving way to hard rock mining. The richest deposits weren't in the stream beds, they were in veins of gold-bearing quartz deep underground. This required capital. Shafts had to be dug, timber had to be cut for supports, equipment had to be hauled in. Individual prospectors couldn't afford it. Mining companies formed, backed by investors from San Francisco, New York, and Chicago. On April 9, 1876, prospectors Fred and Moses Manuel, along with Alex Eng and Hank Harney, located the homestake claim in a fork of Gold Run Gulch, just north of what would become the town of Lead. After getting over $5,000 in gold out of the claim, the partners decided to sell. In June 1877, a syndicate led by George Hurst, a wealthy mining investor from San Francisco, purchased the homestake claim from the Manuel brothers for $70,000. At age 57, Hurst was already wealthy from mining investments throughout the West. He was ambitious, flamboyant, shrewd, and a practical gold miner of the first water. The Homestake Mining Company was incorporated in November 1877 with $10 million in capital. With the completion of an 80-stamp mill in July 1878, Homestake was ready to begin full-scale production. It would become one of the largest and deepest gold mines in the Western Hemisphere. The mine operated continuously for over 125 years, producing more than 40 million ounces of gold. The mine eventually reached depths of 8,000 feet, over 1.5 miles beneath the surface. At its peak, it employed over 2,000 workers and made Lead the second most populous town in South Dakota. The town of Lead grew rapidly around the mine. It progressed from a camp of rough cabins and rough men to a permanent community. By 1910, the census reported 8,210 residents. All of this growth centered on the ever-expanding operations of the Homestake mine. But in 1876, none of that had happened yet. The mining was still rough, individual, chaotic, and the Lakota were watching. Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse saw what was happening. Thousands of white men flooding into the Black Hills, tearing up the earth, building towns, destroying the land that had been promised to the Lakota forever. They couldn't accept it, and they were willing to fight. In June 1876, the U.S. Army launched a 3-pronged campaign to force the Lakota back onto the reservations. One of those columns was led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, the same man whose expedition had started it all. On June 25, 1876, Custer and the 7th Cavalry attacked a massive Lakota and Cheyenne encampment along the Little Bighorn River in Montana Territory. It was the biggest mistake of his life, and also the last. Custer divided his forces and attacked without waiting for reinforcements. He was outnumbered at least 3-1, possibly 5-1. Within hours, Custer and over 260 of his men were dead. The Battle of the Little Bighorn, called the Battle of the Greasy Grass by the Lakota, was the most famous Indian victory in American history, but it was also the beginning of the end. The American public was outraged. Newspapers called for revenge. Congress authorized more troops. The Army intensified its campaign against the Lakota with a fury that wouldn't stop until every band was subdued. One by one, the The Lakota bands were hunted down, starved out, or forced to surrender. Crazy Horse surrendered in May 1877 and was killed in custody 4 months later, bayoneted by a guard at Fort Robinson. Sitting Bull fled to Canada with his followers, only to return and surrender in 1881. By 1877, the Great Sioux War was essentially over. The Lakota had won the battle but lost the war, and the miners kept digging. In 1877, the U.S. government passed an act that unilaterally seized the Black Hills from the Sioux. The Fort Laramie Treaty required that any change to the reservation boundaries be approved by 3/4 of the adult male Sioux population. The 1877 agreement was signed by only about 10%. The act didn't pretend to negotiate fairly. It simply declared that the Black Hills now belonged to the United States. The Lakota were confined to a new, smaller reservation, about 1/5 the size of what the treaty had promised. They had no choice but to accept. It was theft, plain and simple, and it was all because of gold. The Black Hills Gold Rush transformed the region permanently. Deadwood became legendary, a wild, violent town where fortunes were made and lost overnight. In August 1876, Wild Bill Hickok was shot in the back while playing poker at Nuttall and Mann's Saloon. The cards he held, aces and eights, became known as the Dead Man's Hand. Calamity Jane became a frontier celebrity. The town had no organized law for its first year, just vigilante justice and the occasional lynching. Lead, built on the Homestake Mine, became a company town, orderly, profitable, and completely controlled by the mining interests. Workers lived in company housing, shopped at the company store, and worked underground in conditions that were often deadly. By 1880, the population of the Black Hills had swelled to over 25,000. Railroads connected the region to the rest of the country. Telegraph lines brought instant communication. The wild frontier mining camp was becoming civilization. The economic impact was staggering. The Black Hills produced hundreds of millions of dollars in gold over the following decades. The Homestake Mine alone would eventually produce over 40 million ounces, worth over $1 billion at historical prices, before it finally ceased operations in 2001. That wealth didn't go to the Lakota. It went to mining companies, investors, and the U.S. government. The people who had been promised the land forever received nothing. In 1980, over a century after the theft, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in United States v. Sioux Nation of Indians that the seizure of the Black Hills was illegal. The taking of the Black Hills violated the Fifth Amendment. The court awarded the Lakota tribes compensation for the 1877 market value of the land, $17.5 million, plus 103 years of interest at 5%, for a total exceeding $100 million. The tribes refused the money. They still refuse it today. The settlement, placed in a trust account, has grown with interest to over $1 billion, but the Lakota don't want money. They want the land back. As one Lakota leader said, the Black Hills are not for sale. Today, the Black Hills remain one of the most contested pieces of land in America. Mount Rushmore, carved into the sacred mountain the Lakota called the Six Grandfathers, stands as a monument to 4 presidents. To many Americans, it's a symbol of national pride. To the Lakota, it's a desecration carved into stolen land. The gold rush that began in 1874 didn't just transform the Black Hills. It transformed the relationship between the U.S. government and Native Americans forever. It proved that no matter what treaties promised, no matter what laws said, when valuable resources were discovered on Indian land, those promises would be broken. It set a precedent that would be repeated across the West. Oil in Oklahoma, uranium in Arizona, coal in Montana. Every time, the pattern was the same: discovery, broken promises, forced removal, theft. For the miners who flooded into the Black Hills in 1876, it was an adventure, an economic opportunity, a chance at fortune in a hard world. Most of them failed. A few struck it rich. All of them participated in one of the largest land thefts in American history. For the Lakota, it was betrayal, the loss of their sacred land, the end of a way of life, a wound that has never healed. The Black Hills Gold Rush lasted about a decade at its peak. The easy placer gold was exhausted within a few years, but the deep mines like Homestake would operate for over a century, extracting wealth from land that was never legally purchased, never fairly negotiated for, simply taken. And it all started because of one simple fact. There was gold in the Black Hills. And once Americans knew that, nothing else mattered. Not treaties, not promises, not the rights of the people who had lived there for generations. Just gold.